See a few more people signing in.
Yeah, it's great. It's a big turnout.
All right, 8:05. We good to go?
Yes.
Yeah, I think so, Roman.
Awesome. So I'll get us started today. Thank you everybody so much for joining. I know it's late for some of you. For some of you, you're just getting off of work, although who works a 9 to 5 anymore anyway. Today is a really exciting conversation focusing on Canadian folks living in the US, working in the US, wanting to go home to Canada. So I'm a native New Yorker. I have a lot of friends in Canada. I've been to Canada many times. I wish I was in your position. I could just go to Canada, but I can't. So I will live vicariously through all of you potentially. So today we have a really, really exciting panel of professionals. I'm going to be your moderator. So my name is Roman Zelichenko. I'm an a U.S. immigration attorney. Used to be, now I run an immigration tech startup and, sort of try to be staying on top of all things immigration in the US and Canada across the world. I'll just be kind of helping guide our conversation, and we'll get through questions. So before I ask the presenters to introduce themselves, just a quick note, as Carrie mentioned, please drop your comments and your questions into the chat. We will be getting to them towards the end. And I'll be asking some question prompts along the way. And yeah, if you want to take it away, Mark, tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Great. Thanks, Roman. I have a unique perspective here. So I'm the founder of Syndesus. It's a cross-border, or it's a Canadian employment company. I employ Canadians working in Canada for US companies. The idea behind this basically is I'm an American. I've worked in Silicon Valley for 20 plus years for 7 VC-backed startups, but I also lived in Canada 5 years. MBA from the Ivy School at the University of Western Ontario, and also worked in Toronto in venture capital and for other tech companies. I started this company 6 years back because I met a lot of Canadians who wanted to work in New York, Silicon Valley, work for cool US tech companies, but Canada was home and they did not want to leave. And conversely, from working in the Valley or living in New York, I work with a lot of tech companies who are looking for top tier talent. It could be tech, it could be finance, and employing people across the border was a challenge. So I started Syndesus 6 years ago, basically to solve that challenge. I'm a remote employer in Canada for Canadians that could work for US companies.
Sweet, thank you. Elena?
Hi, my name is Elena Hansen, and I am a founding member of Hansen Cross-Border Tax. We are located in Toronto, and we service various types of clients with cross-border tax issues. So whether these are expats residing in the other country, or mobile employees, or businesses, or estates and trusts. And with regards to employees, mobile employees, that's a very large part of our practice. We are focusing on compensations and benefits, and we're also assisting with tax policies for employers. So I've been doing it for over 20 years, and I think I've seen pretty much everything. We've had several brain drains in either direction, so it's kind of very welcome to see now Canadians coming back home.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Elena. And Sophie.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Roman. Great to be here with you all. Mark and Elena and Carrie's joining us. So wonderful, wonderful. I'm a U.S. immigration attorney. A large part of my practice is dedicated to helping Canadians with the U.S. side of their immigration issues and opportunities. I founded Alcorn Immigration Law. We are in Mountain View, California, in the Silicon Valley Bay Area. And I'm a TechCrunch columnist. I have a weekly immigration advice column called Dear Sophie. And you can also catch my podcast, Immigration Law for Tech Startups. So it's great to be here. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you all so much for the intros. So, I'll just very briefly give kind of the intro and then obviously hand it over to the experts in the room. So the idea of this webinar is kind of multifold. number one, as Mark mentioned, and I'm sure as Sophie and Elena have also seen, there are a lot of Canadians living in the U.S. who are just genuinely interested in the question of how can I go home? How can I go home and still work, right? Especially right now, COVID, et cetera. I mean, we'll talk about that stuff. And so there are different reasons as to why people want to go home. And I think this is something that we're going to be touching on today. The question, we're also going to talk about challenges. You can't just go home, especially if you're working. Maybe from an immigration standpoint, yes, you're a Canadian citizen. You can just flash your passport at the border and presumably come back in. But if you have an employer in the US, if you have stocks, stock options, et cetera, there are a lot of questions there. It does present some challenges. So what are some of those challenges? And then of course, the idea about how can you maybe potentially keep your US job and move home to Canada? Sounds like the best of both worlds. So that's something that we'll touch on as well. So quickly to go through the agenda, why do people want to go back? What can go wrong? Because, it's not going to be perfect. I mean, there are implications there. So what can go wrong potentially? Healthcare, very different in the US and Canada. So we're definitely going to touch on that. Taxation and assets. If you have a great job here in the US, hopefully maybe you've bought a place, you have a car, et cetera. How do you deal with those kind of things? Immigration, near and dear to my heart as well. So what are the immigration implications? And then of course, okay, if you want to keep that US job while going back to Canada, how do you keep it as a remote employee? How does that work? And then sort of next steps. And then of course, we'll get to your Q&A. I'm already seeing comments and questions, so please keep them coming. This is all about super engaging. So, before we get into the really nitty gritty about taxation, immigration, and then the remote work, Mark, you mentioned you lived in Canada. Now you live in the US, you studied in Canada. You've done a lot of cross-border work. You run a company that does cross-border work. What are you hearing about, from the perspective of Canadians who wanted to move back in the US who want to move back to Canada?
Yeah, definitely hearing a lot. Thanks, Roman, for the setup. So when COVID hit, if we could all go back to late March, April, May, the comments I used to get a lot, I got a lot of feedback. I got inquiries coming in from Canadians saying, hey, I have an offer letter. I can't cross the border. My company doesn't know what to do. I Googled Remote Employment Canada. I found your company, Syndesus. Mark, what can I do? And I'm like, okay, you can't cross the border. Your immigration lawyer told you you can't come in. That did happen for a few months. We're a remote employer in Canada. Let's get you set up and going. So the conversations were usually around, those were the first conversations around COVID. As the months have gone on, I've noticed the conversations now have flipped. Still have US companies, of course, it's the bread and butter calling us employing Canadians remotely. The inquiries over the last 60 to 90 days now come from Canadians saying, Mark, I'm doing my own research. I want to go home. I'm watching infection rates in the US. I'm seeing my friends back home. I'm seeing how COVID's being controlled in Canada. It's very clear. There's a very different story happening north and south of the border. Hey, I Googled Remote Employment Canada. I found you. So I've had conversations the last couple months. I learned a lot. And these are the issues that I hear the most. COVID tops them out. We also hear about isolation of, hey, I came down here for a super cool job. I'm in New York. I'm in Silicon Valley. I was working in Soma, in San Francisco, and now I'm sitting in an apartment. I'm away from family and friends. That cool office I used to go to, it's shut for the next year. Do I have to be here? Because if anything, there's more isolation among the Canadians, obviously missing family and friends. US politics, I can just leave it there. There is a lot of you shared so much with us in terms of how frustrating that was. We understand, we completely understand. And that's having an effect on a lot of you that's affecting whether you want to stay long-term. We heard people comment on the cost of US healthcare. Obviously, most people, your jobs pay it, but I've had a few conversations with people said, Mark, my company does not pay for all of it. There are some extras that we had to take on. I'm especially worried now during pandemic. I've heard people looking ahead saying, I can see how things have been changing in the US. Maybe I don't want to stay here with the family. So all of these things have come up. These are all questions that come up consistently. We hear you and we understand.
Awesome. Thank you. And yeah, so much to pack in there. But, very briefly, Mark, what if they do move back to work remotely? What are some of the issues that you have kind of touched on at a high level?
Yeah, and these conversations have been great because they're having run an employment firm in Canada for 6 years. I know I'm used to all the issues, but the Canadians I'm speaking with, and I'm seeing both sides. What I'm seeing is some calls are from Canadians in the US saying, I think I want to go home, or I want to go home, I need to go home, walk me through how this works. And then there's plenty of other calls where the conversation is Canadians already in Canada, and it's like, is this okay? Did I do the right thing? It was interesting. I had a screen share with a Zoom call a couple weeks back, and right away someone pops up a screen, and I'm talking with them, and I'm kind of looking behind them, and I'm like, oh, I think that's the Toronto skyline. You're in you must be on the Gardner. I think you're in all those tall buildings, right? Right where I used to live when I lived in Toronto. And they're like, yes, I am. I'm like, so you went back home? And they're like, yeah, I did. And now I'm not sure it's right. I'm not sure it's right. The questions are, did your US employer get involved? Do they know? And why that's an issue is a lot of our clients are in Silicon Valley. We employ Canadians in Canada. There's a lot of complex IP from a US startup or tech company. So right away, I know if the lawyer was on the call for the company, they'd be like, oh, well, we employed you in the US, now you're in Canada. Hey, there's issues around IP. I don't feel so comfortable. We should lock that down with a different agreement. Taxation, which Elaine is going to talk about, immigration, all these issues come up, and we're going to talk about all of them. What I also hear is access to Canadian healthcare. It's, hey, I'm home. How does this work? I have my US healthcare plan, which is useless. Then again, taxation, and then what's going to happen with immigration. All these come up. We're going to walk through them.
Awesome.
And healthcare in Canada. So the first thing we kind of wanted to bold is the first point, which is if you're not paying taxes in your province, you cannot access Canadian healthcare. This issue comes up a lot. So now what it breaks down to is short-term, long-term. A lot of conversations we have, there's 3 answers I get. One is, hey, I just want to go back to Canada 6 months, 9 months, just until things get better, until the vaccine, until the US things get more back to normal. I would prefer to be in Canada, but when it's done, I have a cool US job. I did not want to lose it. I want to come back home. I'm like, okay, so you're thinking shorter term. Then there's another group of people saying, I don't know. I don't know if I'm ready to pull the trigger and move back home to Canada permanently. I probably want to do short term, but I'm not exactly sure. And then the third bucket of people saying, I'm sure, I want to go home. I want to take my job with me. So from the poll, we know a lot of you in a few different buckets. The simplest thing to say is if it is shorter term and it's less than 6 months, every form you fill out at a provincial level for healthcare is going to ask about your intent to stay in Canada, because there's an intent. There's an understanding. As Canadians, you pay for your healthcare through taxes. Once you do that, you're a tax resident of that province. Then you get healthcare. So showing up, not saying anything to anyone, signing up for healthcare isn't quite legal. Short term, you can reach out to your US employer, see if there's travel coverage. You can find out what they cover for you in Canada short term. You can buy travel insurance. The scenario we'll address more is 6 months or more. Yes, you move your job to Canada, you do it through a remote employer like Syndesus. Yes, right away you're back in Canada. You can apply in your province and get healthcare. Absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. And that's actually a really perfect segue, because healthcare and tax really go hand in hand. So Elena, introduction before, here's, your company and your lovely picture. Would you be willing to start us off with a primer in terms of taxation and what it means for this context?
Certainly, Roman. We are all facing this biggest social challenge of working from anywhere. Working remotely. Well, from the tax perspective, that's a bit more complicated, because the borders are very much present, and they matter when it comes to taxes. And the tax law is very much behind. So it's going to take years to liberalize and match the taxation system to how we do business. So what we need to remember is that there's two main concepts in taxation. It's the source of income taxation and residency taxation. So if you come into Canada on a short-term basis and you're not establishing a residency in Canada, but you render services for your US employer, those services are considered Canadian source income, right? So even though the employee is still American, you're still on the US payroll, and the US employer withholds US taxes, the income allocable to those days when you perform employment responsibilities on the Canadian soil, it's Canadian source income. And therefore, you are subject to Canadian tax on that income. So when we have people working remotely, then when they sneak out to Canada and not telling their employer that they're now all of a sudden, doing their work only out of Canada, out of different, sovereign country. So they may get personally in trouble, and they may get the employer in trouble. Because when it comes to employment, it's pretty much a teamwork. It's an employer-employee relationship, and employer must be aware that employee works on a foreign soil from the tax perspective. So there is a concept is that, well, if I'm in Canada less than 183 days, I should, I still retain my US residency, I should not be subject to taxation in Canada. The answer to that, yes and no. So as I mentioned, when you render services in Canada, that's considered a Canadian source income. And under Regulation 102, employer has a responsibility to collect and remit taxes based on where services are performed. So the US employer would need to register, collect income tax, and remit it on a periodic basis to the Canada Revenue Agency. Even though, and then issue a T4 slip at the end of the year. So, equivalent of W-2. So what's happening is that even though you as an employee may fall under the treaty and not be subject to income tax, at the end of the day, because your income is less than 10,000, or you spent less than 183 days in Canada, so you still need to go through the motion, and your employer needs to go through the motion of registering, remitting, and you will get your taxes back only upon filing a tax return and claiming your non-resident status. So it's not that simple. And if the employer does not want to register, then we have a solution, in the form of Mark's company, Syndesus. So they operate as a PEO, a professional employment organization, and they become legal employer for our runaway employee temporarily while the employee works out of Canada. So that's a very much better way for everyone to meet the obligations and be on the right side of the tracks. So Mark has mentioned about healthcare, and yeah, so there's not much to add. That if you decide to use provincial healthcare and you're not eligible, so you need to pay out of pocket, or you need to get a private coverage. So you can't just go, and just because you kept the card for the past 5 years while residing in the States, it doesn't give you a right to go and use that card. So simple as that. And with regards to the filing applications, your responsibility is to file a tax return. So the reality is that there is no threshold in Canada under the domestic law. It's not like, okay, if I made 5,000 Canadian or 10,000, only then my tax reporting arises. No, your tax reporting arises from the first dollar you generated in Canada, and it's not your base salary only, right? It's any type of compensation. It's also your vacation time, or your equity benefits, or your disability insurance, or anything and anything taxable drives the allocation to Canadian work days, allocation of employment income. Okay, so moving on to interesting 2020, when we all living through a very strange reality of the COVID time. So when I explained application of the general policy, that is, in the normal circumstances. So for 2020, we actually have a little bit of relief, which has been issued as an administrative guidance by the government. And what the government basically said, that if you are subject to lockdown, whether you have a travel, there are travel restrictions, or you just plainly not feeling safe to go back to your employer, you may exclude the days of presence in Canada, and your employer is not at risk to collect and remit. So that is certainly a great simplified, position. But again, you gotta be careful, because if you start shuttling between Toronto and California, employer wants to see you for a week, or your scope of responsibility changes in Canada, you are not eligible for this relief. So you gotta read it. It's not black and white. So there's still exceptions. Just be careful. Don't just say, hey, there's an administrative guidance, and I don't have to worry about reporting, or employers doesn't have to worry about withholding. So it's not necessarily the case. And but if you came to Canada because you felt lonely and unsafe, and you continue working, carrying on your ordinary, regular duties, and so your employer compensates, withholds in the States, and part of your compensation may be equity benefits. So the treatment remains the same as if you stayed on the U.S. soil. I just threw it there because I know that a lot of people from California tend to collect additional benefits. So I thought, we'll reference RSUs in this slide. But if you can just move on to the next one, Roman. So, all right, you came to Canada, you reacquainted it with Canada, and decided to stay. So you don't want to go back anymore. What's happening then? Well, you're not longer covered under the source of employment rules, although those matters too. But now you actually a Canadian tax resident, which means that you're subject of Canadian taxation on your worldwide basis. And then when that's when you can benefit from the provincial health insurance and stuff like that. So in this case, from the employer-employee perspective, the employer would have to absolutely must register with a CRA and withhold and remit. And what you gotta be careful about is that employer may run a risk of establishing a taxable presence at the corporate level if the employee does certain duties. For instance, if the employee signs contracts or provides services on behalf of the Canadian resident clients. So those duties, the risk is referred as service permanent establishment. And once employer creates a service permanent establishment, then there are reporting obligations at the branch level. You have also, the employer must be also concerned in this case about indirect tax in Canada and transfer pricing rules. So you opening an additional Pandora box here, and so just again, additional compliance, additional risk. So Syndesus would be the solution. So with respect to what's happening with all the stuff you've accumulated in the States, how you can break the ties and reestablish residency in Canada. Pertaining to your IRAs or 401ks, we actually have now an opportunity to house those plans here in Canada. Raymond James is one of the institutions which actually does that, because I mean, I guess the U.S. company with a branch in Canada, so they're able to house those plans on behalf of Canadian residents. If you retain those plans in the States, there is a risk that the custodian of the institution may, may require you to collapse the plan. So if you're no longer a resident of the U.S., and that has nothing to do with taxation, that's actually financial and banking rules. But that's what we're hearing. You know, we get calls from clients who are absolutely frantic that their 300,000 IRA needs to be liquidated within 90 days. So just be aware of that. And we also have very often splits when families, part of the family moves to Canada, the other part of the family stays in the States, and then people get a bit confused. So where is the true residency is? Because under domestic laws, they may be actually, meeting the residency requirements and treated as residents of each country. So in that case, we bring a treaty to the rescue and look at Canada-US tax treaty, Article 4, to determine, okay, because there's only one country of residency, that you cannot have two countries of residency. But yeah, so I think I am through, Roman. I mean, obviously, the issues of the tax implications and questions, they're just endless, right? We probably need the whole night to cover those. But you know, if someone has any specific questions, I mean, my contacts are at the end of the slides, and they're welcome to contact us.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much, Elena. Yeah, we're getting a lot of great questions, and we're going to have some time for sure towards the end to go through some of the questions. But I know that a lot of you will have very specific, very interesting, nuanced questions. So please do reach out to Elena, Sophie, or Mark with them specifically. I mean, heck, maybe we could do a follow-up one where we just do an hour-long Q&A as well. I mean, who knows? Anyway, Sophie, would you please now share with us your immigration wisdom?
Thank you, Roman. So I've been following a lot of the immigration questions in the chat panel, and I know that many of them will be answered by my presentation. And as Roman mentioned, we'll also have some time for Q&A at the end. So I'm going to be covering some main categories, including non-immigrants in the United States. So if you're here or you were here on a TN or an H-1B or some other type of temporary visa, we're going to be talking about what happens when you leave and how do you come back if you later want to. We'll also be talking about permanent residence and how you either give up your green card or keep your green card, depending on what's right for your personal situation. And if you're already a dual citizen of the US or Canada, you don't need to worry about immigration. So go get yourself a drink and come back to listen to what Mark has to say in a little bit. So let's go to the next slide, please, Roman. So let's first talk about the TN visa, actually TN status. So when you come here on a TN, you are authorized to work for a specific employer in a specific job role for a specific period of time. And as a Canadian, you get an I-94 card placed into your passport upon having your TN application approved. And that is your card, and you show it every time you come in and out, and it has an end date. So if you leave when you're on a TN visa, it's fine. You're allowed to be gone. And then when you're not in the United States, US immigration law does not apply to you anymore. So it really doesn't matter if you stay in Canada for the short term or the long term. If you decide you want to come back at some point, look at your most recent TN. Did the expiration date pass? If it did not yet pass, then are you still working at that company? Are they still willing to let you into the United States and continue to work for them in the exact same capacity as was originally on the TN petition? or application? And if yes, you still have permission to come back in. I would strongly recommend that you get an updated letter from the company stating that this is still a valid offer according to all the original terms and conditions, and you should be fine to return. But if the job position has changed, or if the I-94 has expired, or if you get a job at a different company and you want to come back, you'll need to get a new TN to come back for that future role. Okay, so that's TNs. Now, H-1Bs are similar, but also kind of a lot more complicated in a way. There's just a lot of more nuances because they overlap with green cards more typically. So I saw that somebody asked if they're still going to be covered by an H-1B if you go to Canada. So it's like a TN. If you're outside of the United States, US immigration law does not control you. So if you're from Canada and you were here in the US on an H-1B and you're going back to Canada, you're a Canadian citizen and you can be in Canada. If you're born in India and you have an H-1B and now you want to move to Canada, when you exit the United States, the H-1B is no longer relevant to you. You need to go through the Canadian immigration process with a Canadian immigration attorney. So like the TN, if you leave while on an H-1B, it's fine. The H-1B is valid up to 3 years at a time for the petition. But it's a little bit different if you're somewhere in the green card process. So I'm going to be speaking more about that on another slide. But if you want to stay in Canada, temporarily for the short term, it's fine. You can normally take a vacation when you're on H-1B. You don't have to be in the United States all the time. And if you are returning permanently to Canada, it's a little bit different of a situation than with the TN. With an H-1B, your employer is required to notify US Citizenship and Immigration Services that they are withdrawing your H-1B. So there's a letter that your company needs to write to USCIS to officially let them know that you're done on your H-1B. So next slide, please. Now, if you want to get another H-1B one day, it depends on how much total time you've spent on H-1B and where you are in the green card process. So with the TN, you can keep renewing them indefinitely for life. The H-1B typically has a 6-year maximum before you have to go through the lottery again, unless you're in the green card process. So if you're coming up against that 6-year limit and you have not had a green card started for you, when you return, you definitely want to look at something called recapture, where you're recapturing any time spent outside of the United States and adding that on and reclaiming that for future use inside the US in your 6-year total period. Also, when you come back, if your first H-1B is completely done and you need to get a new one in the future, remember there's 2 ways to get an H-1B. You either get it through the lottery, which historically has been a random process, although there are proposals to make it pay-based, or there are also CAP-exempt H-1Bs that you can get by doing lots of creative things, working at nonprofits, working at universities. There's even a way to adapt this to work at private companies. Now, if you're from India or China and you're considering a move to Canada, you are most likely to be in this limbo called AC-21 extensions. So if your perm has been certified and your I-140 has been approved, it's easy to get unlimited H-1B extensions beyond the 6 years. Doesn't matter if you go to Canada for 3 years, you can still claim these extensions in the future if you want to come back one day. Next slide, please. Okay, so now let's talk about green cards. If your green card is in process, what will happen as a result of you leaving depends on which stage you're at. If your perm is somewhere in process and you decide to leave, you're just basically going to abandon the whole thing. If your I-140 has been approved, you get to keep your priority date for the future. So you'll save your turn in line if you ever want to restart the green card process down the road. If you're in the I-485 stage or consular processing route to actually finally get your green card at the end of all of this, it depends. If you're in the US, you decided to do the adjustment of status I-485 process. If you leave before you get your combo card with advanced parole, you're going to jeopardize the entire I-485 process. You will lose everything you filed and you will give up your green card. So please wait until you have your combo card or advanced parole before deciding to leave the country. And then you must return for your green card interview. And when your green card gets approved, you should return as well to claim your permanent resident status in the United States. But if you haven't filed the I-485 yet and you want to move to Canada, that's fine. You could actually, instead of doing the I-485, go through the consular processing route, and instead of doing adjustment of status, get an immigrant visa from a US consulate in Canada down the road. Just once you have a green card approved, that signifies your intention to move to the US in the future after that green card is approved. And you also just want to make sure that if it's an employment-based green card, you still have the underlying job offer at the original company, or you've used some sort of portability to transfer your job to a future company. Okay, next slide. Now, if you want to get rid of your green card, I mean, we have solutions for everybody. So if you want to get rid of your green card, that is abandoning your US permanent residence. You can do it accidentally, which is a big pain. So normally that would happen if you've been in Canada too long, you didn't do anything before you left to protect yourself. You try to come back in and they say, we want you to leave and give up your green card. And if you say no, they'll say, okay, well, you can come in, but we're going to put you in a deportation trial. So I'd really love for you all to avoid that situation. So we're going to be deliberate. If you definitely know you want to give up your US permanent residence, there's ways to do it at a consulate or by mail. You can do it on purpose. But just know that if you want to become a permanent resident again in the future, you'll have to restart the whole process from scratch. And then let's go to the next slide. If you know you want to keep your green card before you leave to go to Canada, it's really important to get something called a re-entry permit. You need to be in the US when you apply for it. You need to go get your biometrics done before you go to Canada. It will be sent to you by mail. Originally, it will be valid for 2 years, and then you can return to the US to keep seeking 1-year extensions. So this is a way that you can keep your permanent residence while living in Canada. But it is going to, having this card does not protect your ability to become a citizen one day. If you want to become a US citizen, you still need to usually spend at least 50% of the time in the US. But if you do become a green card, then you could go back to Canada permanently. And if you become a US citizen, you could move to Canada permanently and you could always come back to the United States. So lots of nuances there. Next slide. Okay, and that's it. Thank you, Roman.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you, Sophie. So many options and so many different possibilities. So Mark, I want to keep conscious of time. We're at 8:43. You're here kind of culminating the tax, the immigration. Now we're going to talk about, all right, great. We figured that out. We're all good, let's say. How do I actually move? What do I do? How do I get back to Canada? So can we talk a little bit about that? And then, again, we'll save some time at the end for questions.
Sounds good. Yeah, so this quick company overview. People use different terms. PEO, as Elena said, professional employer organization, employer of record, remote employment. They're all a variation of the same thing. Syndesus is a Canadian corporation. We're founded, it's been 6 years, we've been operating. We currently employ 90 workers in Canada, 4 US companies, many in tech, some in finance, some execs, a lot of people on the tech side. Over the years, we've employed hundreds. So we are a legal employer in Canada. Short term, what happens there is, again, what happened during COVID, first few months, people reached out to us and said, I need to start this US job. Can I start this from Canada? Of course you can. I was writing 3 and 4 and 5 month employment contracts. Then I got an email from the worker saying, hey, my TN visa is approved, or hey, I feel good about moving to the US. I'm going to go ahead and cross over. I'm like, great, you will get a termination letter from us on one day. You will get a parallel offer letter from a US corporation starting the next day. We'll just roll you out of ours into theirs. Or long-term options. We have people who have been working with us for over 4 years now and counting. For them, it's, hey, this is my way to work for a US company while being in Canada. I could do cool US work while sitting at home anywhere in Canada. So how it actually works, how this model works, we are a legal employer for workers in Canada. So for example, if we were doing a Zoom call, this happens all the time. I've got the Canadian worker and their US HR person and maybe the US lawyer or general counsel. They want to see how this works. If we were looking at at an offer letter, the Canadian worker would be looking at saying, hey, this is what I used to have in Canada. It's all the Canadian legalities are here. Everything's covered. The American lawyer would look at it and say, okay, I don't know Canadian law, but looks like you're covered under Canadian law. It's a legal letter where we can employ you through Syndesus in Canada. That's where HR and your lawyer for your current company, that's their happy point where they say, hey, look, we can't facilitate this in Canada because we're not a Canadian corporation. Next, the question that comes up, obviously provincial healthcare, you can get that. We provide the extras. We have a healthcare plan that covers vision, dental, better prescription drugs plan, physiotherapy, disability insurance. Again, you look at that, all of our workers look at that and said, hey, this is a great plan. Most of our US companies cover them. Sometimes they'll say, hey, we'll split it with the worker, but usually the US company looks at it and says, hey, this is dramatically lower cost in the US, add it into the bill, sounds great. We can facilitate US stock options. As Elena said, there's some complications. What I'm usually, if you were currently leaving a US company, you will have to exit your US stock option plan. It will, whether you're 1 or 2 or 3 years into it, it stops. Then it would have to restart in Canada. I have a cross-border accounting firm that I work with. They would work with the lawyer and with the HR person from your company. We can facilitate basically starting a new option plan. Under the PEO space, the fourth bullet, the scope of work is between the client. You won't hear from me or anyone on my team checking in on, hey, how'd you do this week? Your manager now remains your manager. The only thing where we get a little bit involved is HR oversight. Basically means my HR person reaches out to your manager, finds out how often you have annual reviews, collects those. We're not on them. We just have to, as we're a legal employer in Canada, we have to be aware of them. What your US employer likes is they're going to look at us and say, oh, wait, those workers in Canada, now this worker is legally compliant with all the HR laws and rules in Canada. Again, a US company looks at this and says, we don't know how to do this. That's where we pay a middleman like Syndesus. It's handled for them. The second to last bullet is important. So the idea of a US company, as Elena said, if you're transacting business for them and you're not using an employer of record or PEO, there is a possibility the US company becomes liable at some point of they're establishing a Canadian corporation. In our model, Syndesus is a Canadian corporation. We employ workers directly. The US client does not have to get involved, does not have to do anything in Canada. They sign a contract with us, done. Lastly, how it works for you, we're collecting from the Americans your paycheck. We're paying you in Canadian dollars to your Canadian bank account twice a month, net of all taxes to the CRA. We're also charging the US company your employer taxes like they pay right now in California, New York, Massachusetts. Therefore, the employer looks at this and says, hey, that's great. We see that we're paying all taxes to the Canada Revenue Agency. Wonderful. You look at this and say, I get a paycheck, just like I did in the US, net of all taxes, get a T4 at the end of the year. In terms of how it works, US client means your US company. They sign a contract with us. Syndesus sends you an offer letter. It's identical to what you have in the US. The only difference is it's in Canadian dollars. If you had unlimited vacation, if you had 5 weeks vacation, whoever your manager was, what your title was, nothing changes. We basically duplicate it, except if you were reading it, you'd say, hey, this is Canadian compliant. I remember offer letters like this I used to have in Canada. All the Canadian laws are there. It's just in Canadian dollars, you're paid in Canadian dollars. Client looks at it, approves it, you get it via DocuSign, you sign it, you start working. We onboard you with payroll, the supplemental health plan, taxation. You are now a tax resident of Canada. We are handling your payroll. We're handling all that in the US, so your US company can legally employ you. Pricing, US 1,300 to start, US 850. Pricing is important here because a question that comes up with a lot of the conversations I have with Canadians who are thinking about doing this, there's always a hesitation of, I don't know if my US employer is going to want to do this. I'm looking at your pricing, Mark. I do the math. This is a lot to ask. What I tell them, the question I always ask is, what is your US healthcare cost right now? And if you're in California, like a lot of you are, New York, Massachusetts, Washington, your US employer is paying anywhere from $900 to $1,200 to $1,400 per month in US healthcare for you. So what we do to make it simple is, once that number is floated out there, if the HR person's on the call, quickly we say, well, that number is going away. Canadians going back home. You're not paying these ridiculous American healthcare costs. We just saved you 1,000 or more. Use that, apply it to the fee. In some cases, the US employer says, Mark, we're paying $700 or $800 for Canadian healthcare. We want to pay for the supplemental plan back in Canada. I'll modify my price to fit. So what I'm basically telling the Americans is, this is cost neutral. You're not spending anything extra here. We'll use the cost savings, apply it to the fee. Lastly, how it works. Some people said, Mark, I need some help. I need to share this with my US employer. You can share this webinar. We're going to send this out. What we're also doing is we have an employer-focused webinar, similar to content here, but it's basically for your US HR person saying, here's how it works for you. It's a shorter webinar. It's not going to cover a lot of the immigration or taxation issues. It's more of a cut to the chase of, here's remote employment in Canada. Here's how you do it as a US company. Here's some of the costs involved. But always the easiest thing to do is, you'll see it in the slide presentation, just schedule a call with me and your employer. We can just walk through this. The calls are never more than a half hour. US HR and their lawyer, they quickly get this. It's a similar slide deck to what I showed you. The calls go very fast. And usually the US employer's like, wow, I didn't know this existed. This is really simple. This is very straightforward. Hey, this allows us to legally employ the Canadian worker when they're going back. Let's move forward. This sounds reasonable. It's a very simple conversation.
Awesome. So thank you, Mark. This is super practical information. I know it says here questions. A lot of you have been dropping amazing questions in the in the comments section in the chat. Just as a quick note here, just about getting in touch information, free consult. I mean, basically we just got a consult from you, Mark, but obviously from a personalized perspective, syndesus.com. Sophie Alcorn, if you have immigration law questions, I know there were some other outstanding ones, check at alcorn.law. And then for Elena, of course, whether you're going, whatever your questions are around tax and the cross-border side around that, hcbtax.com obviously is for you all, and there's phone numbers here. You'll get this, right? Mark, will folks be getting this slide deck? Or
yeah, we can definitely send this out, the recording of all this, but all this information, we'll definitely share this with everyone who signed up, and also for the people who signed up and couldn't make it. Yeah, we'll share this with everyone.
Perfect. Awesome. Okay. And so, yeah, very quickly, Mark, if you just want to mention like this follow-up.
Yeah, this is what I referred to on there's a coming up on December 2nd on the upper left. We'll send a reminder out. So some people just ask like, okay, Mark, I'm going to be on this webinar here on the 18th at 5 p.m., but this isn't something that's for my employer. We split it out and said, yeah, we'll do an employer-focused one just to walk them through so they can understand the model.
Perfect. Awesome. Thank you. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen right now, and it's going to go to all of the, see each other on the screen. What I'm going to do is I'm going to jump on and get some questions, because we've had a lot of great questions. And we've pulled them all into a document, which, Carrie, thank you so much. If all of you are in the chat, I know there's so much chat here, so much chatter rather. So I'll jump in with, I'm just going to pull out some random questions. If I didn't get to you, everyone's question is great. Please reach out to anyone here who is the person who you want to talk to. So let's see here. One question here we've got is from, I'm just going to go, if you already took the liberty of, from Iona, if I already took the liberty of moving back to Canada after getting my company's immigration attorney blessing, I was on H-1B, what does this mean from a tax perspective, should I be paying resident taxes in both the US and Canada?
Okay, all right. So I guess this question is for me.
Yes.
We need to determine where is your permanent home is right now. So if you move to Canada and your intention is to remain in Canada, and that's where you have your home and your social ties and your family, so that is your tax home, and therefore you are Canadian tax resident and taxed on a worldwide basis in Canada. With regards to the days pre-arrival to Canada, if US was your home back then you are subject to worldwide taxation at the federal and state levels from January 1st to the day of departure. That's a general rule, okay? So there may be some variations to that answer depending on the particular facts. But the general concept is where your tax home is. Whenever your principal home is, sorry, that's where your tax home is. Unless you're a U.S. citizen, then the answer will be slightly different.
Awesome. Thank you, Elena. So Andrew, Andrew asked a couple questions which related to immigration. I'm going to kind of throw them all in together. Andrew says, we've been fortunate enough to get our green card this year before we left the US. And now we've been remotely working in Canada for the last couple of months. What are the implications of this? And are there limits to how long I can remain outside of the US because of COVID? I think as we went on, Andrew said we weren't aware of healthcare implications, have already used some health card services without paying taxes. What can go wrong with this? And sort of how long can, Andrew asked, how long can we stay in Canada with a green card if we, and still maintain it if we return? So I know it's a little bit of a compounded question, but I think Sophie, at least in part for you, are there implications of continuing to work remotely in Canada? They got their green card, and then in terms of maximum time of stay in Canada with a green card.
Okay, great. Happy to comment on the immigration components for Andrew. So congratulations on getting your green card. That's great. If you've been out of the United States for less than 6 months, that's wonderful. And I strongly urge you to plan a return trip to the United States for maybe 3 to 6 weeks, maybe 8 weeks if you can handle it. And for your return date to the US to be sometime before the 6-month mark on your time out so far on this trip. And then once you get here, it's good to file a reentry permit while you're here. We can support you with that. And we can also help you try to figure out how to get the fingerprint process sped up so you can get your fingerprints taken care of before it's time to leave again without needing to wait the standard several months. The risk is that, if you're gone longer than 6 months, that could be considered an abandonment of your permanent residence. It's just risky. So if you can come back sooner, great. If you can't, please talk to us anyways so we can evaluate whether your reasons why you can't are strong enough to see if there's anything else we can do, but know that it's still risky. It's a legal gray area.
Got it. Thank you. Yeah. So 6 months is the magic number if you've got a green card in terms of being outside of the country, it sounds like. Morgan asks, I work for an aerospace firm subject to ITAR laws. How does that affect moving back to Canada while retaining my US job? I don't know, Mark, if this is something that you can touch on.
Yeah, so probably the best thing is to reach out to me. So I've had questions from people like in finance saying, hey, I'm in finance. There's FINRA laws. How does that work if I transfer to Canada? I'm like, good point. That's probably a conversation with me and my lawyer and you and your company's lawyer. I'm not familiar with ITAR. I've had people in defense industry talk about them in the US saying, hey, I want to go back. That also becomes a question of let's get our lawyers on the phone. When the questions come up in this space, one thing that comes up is around intellectual property and protection of it and how sensitive data. So because a lot of our clients are in Silicon Valley and they're venture capital backed, this question comes up. This is comes up all the time. What used to happen is in prior years, our US clients would, the worker would sign Syndesus agreement, their employee in Canada. Then the US lawyer's like, hey, I'm going to send my IP confidentiality agreement to the worker separately on our letterhead. I'm like, oh, that's your California or your Florida agreement. Great. about a year back, my Canadian lawyers were reviewing them. They're like, okay, look, that's not the best way to protect your US clients. It is a US agreement to someone sitting in Canada. There's questionable enforcement. So what we did then is we went a little farther. I'm going to make up a word here. We Canadianized the IP agreements we had, the best ones we got that were the most stringent from our Silicon Valley clients. Now that it sits as an addendum B in your offer letter. So you have a Canadian offer letter, all the Canadian laws are there. Schedule A is your job description. Schedule B is an IP and confidentiality agreement. It can stand up in Canadian court. Now the US clients are like, hey, this is awesome. But I continually see month after month as their general counsel looking at this saying, wow, we're protected in Canada. I like this. Thanks for covering this off. I've mentioned that because if you mention aerospace, if there's sensitive data you're dealing with, it's something we can probably address, but it would probably definitely be a one-on-one conversation.
Awesome. Thank you. So I know it's 9 p.m. here in New York, 6 p.m. Pacific. Are you all okay staying for a couple more minutes? Just maybe we can get one or two more questions. And then, I mean, there's so many great questions. All right, cool. And then of course, obviously to folks who are still here, thank you. If you have to jump, totally understand. Thank you so much. If you can stay for a couple more minutes, we'll try to get to a few more questions. Obviously we can't get to all of them, but again, I'll keep reiterating, please reach out to folks. So I think, Mark, this question might be for you. This is kind of an interesting one. Would Syndesus be considered the Canadian entity of the employee's company and then use that to transfer back to the US?
No, we wouldn't be their entity. So sometimes, and I saw another question in the chat, someone brought up of like, hey, can't my US company just set up a subsidiary up here and they could employ you? Yes, in that scenario, so I'm going to answer both those questions, Roman. If your company chose to say, hey, look, we want to employ you and maybe 20 or 30 other people in Canada, maybe 5 or 10 others. It's a service that Syndesus offers to help US companies. How those calls go, we just had one this week, was the US company asks, what does it take to set up in Canada? And I'm like, $4,000 to $5,000 for a Canadian incorporation, real simple. You're going to get a cross-border accounting firm that's going to cost your company $5,000 or $10,000. They're going to file taxes in Canada every year. You're going to need a Canadian employment lawyer, so you have a Canadian offer letter because your US one won't work. Canadian banking, cross-border accounting practices happening every year. You lay that all out, and that's where the US company usually says, that's too complicated for 1 or 2 people. That's a lot of money and time. I'm going to go the PEO route. This is simple. This just takes care of the problem. I pay a monthly fee. I don't have to worry about any of this cross-border taxation, 2 corporations, 2 global entities. So that answers one of the questions that came up in chat. But yeah, in this question, if I understand it correctly, Roman, I think the answer basically is Syndesus is a separate corporation. We are legally the employer in Canada. The 90 people, according to Canadian law, we employ them. We are their legal employer of record. A few paragraphs into the offer letter, it says, you are assigned to, and has the name of the US client, your manager is your US client. So it's a relationship basically where we are still the legal employer, but your work is done in the US. But no, under PEO agreement, your US company is not set up an entity in Canada.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that answers it. And I think maybe to kind of touch on that a little bit, Tyler asks, let's say 2 years down the road, employee and company, US company part ways. Can Syndesus help facilitate new employment opportunities as well? I mean, because, I think if folks move, you mentioned short and long term, if you move long term, like in any company, there's potential to you lose, you don't want to work there anymore, or maybe you get let go or what have you. Is there any way Syndesus can support that?
So what we can do, and this question comes up a lot of clients, as I mentioned, are VC backed, companies disappear, companies run out of funding. So the position we're in is we can't find your US job, but what I often get calls on is a Canadian calling up saying, hey, I've got an offer. My US company doesn't know how to employ me up here. I just did my own research and I'm going to rig a call up with all of us, but Mark, just to be sure you can employ me legally for this cool company in Boston. I'm like, yes. So if you had found the job on your own and said, hey, I've got another company willing to hire me remote, then we could hire you if you found that job. The challenge would be if you're in Canada, we're not looking, we can't find you a new job, but if you found one on your own, sure, we'll just move the employment to that new company.
Awesome.
And
Thank you.
something to
Yeah.
add. So when employees or employers inquire about PO type companies, we explain to them that PO is gonna be your legal employer, but American company is gonna be your economic employer. So it's basically a dual employment relationship, right? Because your work is still gonna be controlled by your economic employer.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay, I want to kind of ask maybe one more tax, one more immigration question, then we'll let everyone go about their day. I have here a tax question for you, Elena, from Alexi, or someone asked, if a Canadian sole proprietor who moved permanently to the US continues to run remotely a sole proprietorship in Canada, and they don't have ties to Canada, like they're not there, only their clients are in Canada, do they have to file a T1 return in Canada and pay taxes on income earned in Canada? So I think this person is living in the US, but still running their business out of Canada. There's still Canadian tax implications.
Right. So this is an excellent question. Whatever we spoke today was with regards to employer-employee relationship. So the rules are very different for those as opposed to independent contractors. That's what I guess Alexi is asking. So what is happening is that if your clients are based out of Canada and you're rendering services out of the US, then technically you don't need to file anything because you do not work physically in Canada. Your the payors, your customers also don't have withholding obligations with respect to any payments they make to you, although they may withhold 15% tax. So to avoid any risk of withholdings, you may want to get a Reg 105 waiver. So in which case you can collect the entire amount of the payments for your services. And again, from the Canadian perspective, the service is sourced, the service income is sourced based where the services are physically rendered. So because they're not physically rendered in Canada, that's not a Canadian source income.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you. Sophie, I have two very quick questions, but they both came up. I think they're both interesting and touch on some of what you talked about. One of them is, I think maybe just a reiteration, but Jeremy asked, do the guidelines for maintaining your green card apply when going to the EU for an extended period, like 2 years?
Yeah, it doesn't matter where you're headed. It could be Tanzania or the South Pole. If you want to keep the green card, be proactive.
Awesome. Yeah, that's kind of what I thought, but I know we're talking about Canada, but maybe just in case. So yeah, perfect. And then there's a question here that maybe might be on people's minds, especially if folks are thinking short term. And this might be just subjective, right? But how strict are border officers with letting Canadians come in and out of the U.S. with a valid TN visa nowadays, I guess?
Oh, well, they're probably stricter than they were 4 years ago, but they're also the most lenient border officers for anybody from any country. So you're in a relatively fortunate situation. I haven't heard of too many mean border officers in COVID. I think everybody is just getting along these days. And I think that will even ease up further in the coming years. So I'm optimistic. I don't think it's too bad, but you still want to make sure you meet all the legal requirements, but it's totally navigable.
Awesome. Perfect. Thank you. I mean, we still have people on here. So if you all want to stay for another couple of minutes, Mark, we have two interesting questions, kind of tough ones, but I think, people want to hear the pros and the cons. So there's a question here from Kuram, asks, why is Syndesus better than becoming a contractor from a tax perspective? I guess that's for you and Elena, I suppose.
Yeah, that is a good one, because that is probably one of the most common questions that comes up, either from a U.S. employer or from the Canadian, of basically, hey, I can just send a contractor agreement, and no one, and we've been doing this for years. What's the problem? They sign it, we wire the money every month, we agree on whatever the fee is, whatever the monthly payment is, we're good. So on that, to answer that, I'll break it into two pieces. First, I would have, if all of us are on a call together, and it's the Canadian worker, it's the US HR person, and the lawyer again. So for the Canadian worker, I usually ask, hey, are you used to operating as a contractor? Do you have your own, Canadian corporation? And some people are like, Mark, I've been doing this for years. This is how I roll. And then, if that's the case, my follow-up question on, hey, do you want, supplemental healthcare plan paid for your US employer? That's where I might get a reaction of, yeah, I kind of do want that. I do want the vision and dental care and all the extras that is hard to get on my own. That's sometimes a stumbling point. Then the other one is the Canadian worker says, yeah, I don't really want to be paying my taxes, doing my own taxes every year. I would prefer that I got a paycheck 15th last day of the month with all taxes taken out. I want to be treated like an employee. Those are the only things where a worker may say, hey, I don't like this contract agreement. When I flip that question to the US company and I ask, how are you protecting yourself with IP, the agreement I discussed earlier, when the lawyer says, well, I'm just going to send them our Arizona or California agreement, when I mention, oh, how enforceable that in Canada, then you get a reaction from the lawyer of the company saying, hey, I don't know if I feel so good about this. I'm looking at your IP agreement that's, Canadianized. That looks pretty solid. We don't have that. Then you also hear the HR person saying, we hire people, again, a lot of my clients are tech companies are like, we hire people who are part of like our team. If you're a contractor, you're not so much part of our team, then it's Mark, we're looking at you as Syndesus to help facilitate a whole, like an employee experience where someone has taxes taken care of, they have the healthcare package, they're more treated like an employee. And that's where your HR is saying, okay, maybe I don't like this contractor agreement. We want a closer relationship with a Canadian worker. We'd like to hear that they have a Canadian offer letter. We like to hear that they are protected in Canada. We take care of our employees in the US. We would like to take care of them in Canada. We can't legally because we don't know how to. Okay, in that arrangement, a contractor agreement is not going to work. That's where we're going to, engage your services as a PEO because we want that level of legal protection, IP protection, and experience for the worker in Canada. Those are the reasons that I hear.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. And I mean, being a contractor is tough because you have to be your own sort of HR, legal, tax department. And that is in part why it's nice to have an employer. I think a second question here, a little, and I don't know, Elaine, if you wanted to touch on that.
Yeah, I want to mention from the tax perspective.
Yeah.
I mean, this area, employer versus self-contractor, that's one of the, I would say, focal audit areas. So both CRA and IRS are pretty aggressive because they know that that is being violated by both employers and employees. So it truly doesn't matter how you call yourself. It's about the factual stuff. It's what kind of relationship, what kind of history you have, especially when we know that in the States, when the person worked, it was an employee-employee relationship, and then when the person moved to Canada, all of a sudden that person is called contractor. Well, that's incorrect. Also, the contracting relationship may actually be hurting you if you get equity benefits because. Then your stock options are being taxed as service income upon grant, and also they become subject of indirect taxation. Finally, California just recently enacted a provision with respect to the location of benefit, and that's when we have non-resident California contractors who are rendering services for the benefit of the California resident customer. So what California does at the state level, they actually impose a state tax on that income. So what we have a conflict. We have the same income being double taxed with no foreign tax credit mechanism. So the contractor will be paying tax to Canada because that's where the contractor is rendering services on the Canadian soil. And then on the same income, the contractor will be paying tax at the California level because under this new provision, and I guess That provision's been tested in court, and court affirmed that, upheld that that was a legal position. So so now we have the same income taxed twice with no offset. So versus this will not be the case if we have employee-employee relationship. So again, that's not necessarily the better way to go from the taxation perspective.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you, Elena. I think that it is important because folks think like, I'll just work for myself and, it'll be fine. And it's hard because it's also easy to funnel money into weird things. And our tax authorities, I suppose, do care about that. Cool. Well, I think, it's 9:15 on our end here. I want to say that maybe we should call it a day. And I think we see some folks jumping off. Does everyone feel comfortable with that?
This was great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, happy to. Roman, as you pointed out earlier, all of our contact information will be sent out. There are a lot of questions. A lot of these are very in depth. Please reach out to any of the three of the panelists that are where you with your questions that are specific. Happy to engage with you.
And you know what? If the folks who are still here, if you want to follow up, just tell everybody. Email Mark, Sophie, Elena, and myself, and just be like, hey, can we do another hour-long, just straight up Q&A? Hey, if there's demand, the supply will get there, I promise you. So please, reach out, everybody. Thank you all so much for the engagement, for the amazing comments, for sharing your information and asking questions. Thank you so much, Mark, Elena, Sophie, Carrie as well, for having all of this run so smoothly. It's been a pleasure. I've learned so much. And have a great night, everybody.
Cool. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah.
Thank you so
Take care.
much.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.